make you disappointed in him?
In Dylan?
Yeah.
No, and that remark is complete.
A place that's reserved for very few, Bob Dylan and you, in writing.
Well, you know, that's a great honor.
Bob Dylan knows this more than...
Bob Dylan is often described as one of the greatest songwriters of all time, a poet of rock and folk music who reshaped the landscape of popular culture. From the moment he burst onto the scene in the early 1960s with his raw voice and cutting lyrics, Dylan became a cultural force, admired for his authenticity, his rebellious spirit, and his unmatched ability to turn words into anthems. Songs like Blowin' in the Wind and Like a Rolling Stone weren't just hits, they became generational hymns, cementing Dylan as a voice of change and revolution. But where there is greatness, jealousy often follows. Dylan's rapid rise, his critical acclaim, and his knack for always staying one step ahead left many of his contemporaries struggling in his shadow. Some musicians felt frustrated that their own work, no matter how polished, could not achieve the same level of cultural impact. Others envied his ability to transcend genres, folk, rock, blues, even country, while still being hailed as a genius by critics and fans alike. And while Dylan may not have cared much about his rivals, the truth is that several well-known musicians privately and publicly displayed envy of his career, his influence, and his enduring legacy. In this video, we'll uncover the top 6 musicians who were jealous of Bob Dylan, exploring the rivalries, tensions, and unspoken resentments that surrounded one of music's greatest icons. From bitter comments to competitive songwriting battles, these stories reveal just how much Dylan's genius rattled even the most successful stars of his era. By the end, you'll see how jealousy shaped some of the most fascinating relationships in music history, and how Dylan, almost effortlessly, always managed to stay ahead. In the early 1960s, Bob Dylan emerged from the Greenwich Village folk scene like a comet. Young, scrappy, and endlessly inventive, Dylan didn't just play music, he embodied a cultural shift. While other folk singers focused on tradition and purity, Dylan infused his songs with biting social commentary, surreal imagery, and raw honesty. His work resonated with a restless generation, propelling him far beyond the coffeehouse circuit into the mainstream. But Dylan's rise was not universally celebrated. Among his peers, admiration was often mixed with envy, as 2 key figures from the folk revival era struggled with his sudden dominance. The first was Phil Ochs, a talented songwriter and activist who many believed could have been the voice of the movement. Ochs and Dylan shared stages, friends, and even political causes, but the comparisons were inevitable and painful. While Ochs was admired for his sharp protest songs, Dylan's work carried an intangible magic that catapulted him into superstardom. Critics hailed Dylan as a prophet, while Ochs was labeled the other guy. This constant comparison gnawed at Ochs, who openly admitted his frustration. In private, friends recalled his bitterness toward Dylan's fame, especially after Dylan shifted from protest songs to more personal, abstract work and was still celebrated as a genius. For Ochs, who remained tethered to topical songwriting, Dylan's success felt unfair, even insulting. Their friendship soured, and though Ochs respected Dylan's talent, the jealousy lingered until his untimely death. The second was Tom Paxton, another folk contemporary who quietly resented Dylan's disregard for folk traditions. Paxton was a craftsman of song, respected among peers, but he watched Dylan break every rule, playing electric guitar, abandoning the folk purity, and writing lyrics that defied convention, yet still being hailed as a revolutionary. Paxton later admitted his envy, noting that Dylan's daring risks redefined the entire scene while leaving others scrambling to catch up. For Ochs and Paxton, Dylan was both an inspiration and a painful reminder of how one artist's brilliance could eclipse even the most talented peers. Their jealousy marked the first sparks of tension in what would become a long history of musicians, measuring themselves against Bob Dylan. As Bob Dylan transitioned from folk to rock in the mid-1960s, his career reached another level of influence. The infamous moment when he went electric at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965 marked not only a turning point in his music, but also in the entire direction of popular culture. By blending rock instrumentation with his poetic lyrics, Dylan became a bridge between traditional folk and the surging counterculture movement. For fans, this was revolutionary. But for several established rock musicians, Dylan's sudden dominance was both inspiring and infuriating. Two iconic figures in particular, Donovan and John Lennon, felt the sting of jealousy as Dylan rose higher than ever. Let's start with Donovan, the Scottish singer-songwriter often nicknamed the British Dylan. While Donovan had undeniable talent and created memorable hits like Catch the Wind and Sunshine Superman, the comparison to Dylan never worked in his favor. Critics, and even fans, often portrayed him as a lesser imitation of the American legend. Donovan himself admitted that these comparisons bothered him deeply. In interviews, he tried to separate his work from Dylan's, emphasizing his unique style. But behind the scenes, the Shadow Dylan cast was immense. Dylan himself was famously dismissive of Donovan, once mocking him during a press conference, which further fueled public perception of Donovan as second best. This wounded Donovan's pride, and while he continued to build a strong career, the jealousy he felt toward Dylan's effortless cultural dominance lingered for years. The second major case of envy came from John Lennon. Although Lennon was already a superstar with the Beatles, Dylan's lyrical depth struck a nerve. In the early days, Lennon admired Dylan immensely. He even admitted Dylan pushed him to write more personal and introspective lyrics. But admiration quickly turned into rivalry. Lennon, known for his sharp wit and competitive nature, grew frustrated at the constant comparisons between himself and Dylan. Journalists would ask who was the greater songwriter, and critics often framed Dylan as the true poet while the Beatles were seen as mere pop stars. This deeply irritated Lennon, who prided himself on artistic credibility. The rivalry simmered through the mid-1960s, even as Dylan and Lennon shared a complex friendship. Dylan's knack for reinvention and critical acclaim stoked Lennon's insecurities, especially during the Beatles' transition from pop to more experimental work. Both Donovan and Lennon illustrate how Dylan's presence in the rock world provoked not just admiration, but also envy. His fearless boundary pushing forced others to rethink their own artistry, often leaving them feeling overshadowed. For Donovan, the comparison was a career-long burden. For Lennon, it became a source of competitive fire that pushed him to evolve, but not without resentment. Dylan's genius didn't just change music, it disrupted egos, even among the most celebrated musicians of the era. By the 1970s, Bob Dylan had already cemented his place as a living legend. He had gone from being the scrappy voice of the folk movement to a rock innovator, releasing albums like Highway 61 Revisited and Blonde on Blonde that forever altered the landscape of modern music. While he continued to evolve, experimenting with country and gospel influences, an entire new generation of singer-songwriters emerged, artists who admired him but also found themselves suffocated by his towering presence. For many, Dylan wasn't just a peer. He was an immovable standard that they could never quite measure up to. Among them, Neil Young and Joni Mitchell stand out as two of the most notable who wrestled with both admiration and jealousy toward Dylan. Neil Young, often dubbed the godfather of grunge decades later, built his reputation on deeply personal songwriting and his ability to shift between delicate acoustic ballads and raw electric rock. Yet, even as Young carved his own niche, he often felt overshadowed by Dylan's cultural gravitas. Dylan's words carried political and poetic weight that critics continually used as the gold standard when evaluating Young's work. In interviews, Young expressed a mix of reverence and competitive frustration, admitting that Dylan was always the benchmark he was judged against. His 1975 album, Tonight's the Night, carried a raw honesty comparable to Dylan's confessional style, but critics often reduced him to being Dylan-esque. For an artist as ambitious and independent as Young, the constant comparisons stung. Joni Mitchell's relationship with Dylan was even more complicated. A lyrical genius in her own right, Mitchell revolutionized songwriting with albums like Blue and Court and Spark. Yet despite her brilliance, she frequently found herself measured against Dylan's influence. While she respected his talent, Mitchell was openly critical of him, at times dismissing his voice as fake and accusing him of adopting personas rather than bearing his true self. Her sharp critiques revealed not just artistic differences, but also an undercurrent of jealousy. Joni was frustrated that Dylan, a male artist, was universally hailed as a prophet, while women in the same field had to fight harder for recognition. For Mitchell, the inequity in how Dylan was revered compared to others fueled a lingering resentment, even as she acknowledged his enormous impact. What made Dylan so difficult for his peers was his ability to constantly reinvent himself. Just when other songwriters thought they had caught up, Dylan would shift again, whether it was embracing electric rock, moving into country on Nashville Skyline, or surprising fans with gospel influences in the late 70s. His unpredictability meant that he was always one step ahead, leaving his contemporaries chasing shadows. For Young, this was both maddening and inspiring, pushing him to experiment more boldly. For Mitchell, it became a point of contention, as she believed authenticity meant consistency, not endless reinvention. The jealousy Dylan provoked in these singer-songwriters speaks volumes about the pressures of working in his orbit. Neil Young and Joni Mitchell were extraordinary artists, each with groundbreaking careers, yet they still found themselves haunted by comparisons to Dylan. He wasn't just another musician, he was the yardstick by which greatness itself was measured. For those striving to leave their own mark, that comparison was both a motivator and a lifelong burden. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Bob Dylan was no longer just a cultural icon. He was a myth in motion. He had lived through the folk revival, rock revolutions, and even his own born-again Christian phase. Yet his name carried weight across every corner of music. While some contemporaries had learned to live with his shadow, others struggled more deeply, unable to escape the comparisons. Two figures in particular, John Lennon and Paul Simon, stand out as musicians whose complicated feelings toward Dylan often tipped into jealousy. John Lennon's rivalry with Dylan was one of the most talked about of the era. While the Beatles and Dylan admired each other, their relationship was steeped in mutual critique and subtle one-upmanship. Dylan famously influenced the Beatles to expand their songwriting, steering them toward deeper and more poetic lyrics. Yet Lennon, who prided himself on brutal honesty and wordplay, often bristled at Dylan's reputation as the voice of a generation. Lennon once remarked that Dylan's mystique was more about what people put on him than what he actually was, a thinly veiled jab at the pedestal Dylan occupied. Behind this criticism, though, was a touch of envy. Dylan could release an obscure, cryptic record and still be hailed as a genius, while Lennon often felt the crushing expectation of having to constantly prove himself. Their friendship, tinged with rivalry, was a constant dance of admiration and competitive fire. Paul Simon, meanwhile, had an even more strained relationship with Dylan's dominance. As half of Simon and Garfunkel and later a successful solo artist, Simon built a career on introspective, sophisticated songwriting. Yet critics repeatedly compared his lyricism to Dylan's, often framing him as a runner-up in the same category. Simon resented the implication that he was somehow a second Dylan, despite his own remarkable success. At times, he openly mocked Dylan's style, parodying his nasal delivery in interviews. But beneath the humor lay a real frustration. Dylan's shadow seemed inescapable. For Simon, every folk-influenced chord progression, every piece of poetic wordplay invited the same comparisons. While Dylan was celebrated as revolutionary, Simon often felt pigeonholed, his individuality dismissed by the constant association. The jealousy both Lennon and Simon harbored highlights a central truth. Dylan didn't just inspire, he disrupted. He had a way of bending the rules of songwriting so completely that others were forced to react, either by emulating him, rejecting him, or trying desperately to carve out space beyond his influence. Lennon, for all his brilliance, couldn't fully shake the weight of Dylan's presence when trying to assert his own artistic depth. Simon, likewise, found himself irritated that his originality was so often measured by another man's yardstick. But what makes Dylan's story so fascinating isn't just the jealousy he provoked. It's how he absorbed it, almost feeding off the friction. Dylan rarely acknowledged these rivalries in public. He seemed to float above them, reinventing himself whenever expectations grew too heavy. His aloofness, whether intentional or not, only deepened the frustration of his contemporaries. To them, he was both untouchable and infuriating. Looking back now, it's clear that the envy Dylan sparked wasn't just about his music, it was about his freedom. While others worried about how they were perceived, Dylan seemed to move on instinct, following his muse wherever it led. That kind of unshackled creativity is what made him so unique, and it's also what made others jealous. He had what they craved, the ability to set his own terms and still be hailed as a genius. In the end, the list of musicians who struggled with Dylan's shadow is long, but Lennon and Simon exemplify just how complex that struggle could be. They admired him, critiqued him, and envied him in equal measure. And perhaps that's the greatest testament to Dylan's impact. He wasn't just a peer, he was a measuring stick for greatness itself. The jealousy he inspired was proof of his dominance, a reminder that for all his flaws and reinventions, Bob Dylan had something no one else could ever replicate. He was Bob Dylan, and that alone was enough to unsettle even the greatest of his peers.